Now, in terms of representation and advocacy, here's the next set of overlaying stories. The development of ethnic community structures as program and service deliverers increases resources but decreases voice given the reliance on funding. Now, there are some organisations which are language specific, whether they be Greek or Italian or Chinese, or some which are religious specific, whether they be Islamic or Jewish. And in these organisations now, they are not just receiving funds of a small nature, but they might be, and some of them are, into the tens of millions of dollars a year. And what they're doing is they are providing nursing homes. They are building and providing nursing homes. They are providing employment services. They have community buses. They have developed the infrastructure to specifically meet the needs of their communities. But then when you talk to them about, well, why didn't you do more about this issue? They say, well, you know, the reality is what we've achieved is vulnerable and we don't want to speak too loudly. The infrastructure, we used to have a thing called migrant resource centres, and these were structures which were funded by government that new arrival groups could come to and be serviced in terms of their new needs. What was really interesting about this, that the migrant resource centres were funded under a government model, which basically said, here are the areas where there are new migrants, we are going to fund a structure there, and they funded the infrastructure, a coordinator, a deputy coordinator, and rental for a space. This was changed, and core funding was removed from these organisations, and these were really strong advocacy bodies. But because the core funding was removed, what happened was that they then had to make their money other ways. If they needed to survive, then they needed to be able to get more functional specific funding. They needed to provide a whole range of other services, and hopefully there was enough fat in those grants to allow the infrastructure to run. And invariably, alongside this, with competitive tendering, a sector which used to work together then starts to come apart. Because all of a sudden, yes, I know I've got my domain, but because I'm not receiving core funding and I might just see if I can move over there, and maybe if I provide a service over there, I can attract some funds. But the only problem is there were other organisations already over there. And we start getting this fragmentation of the ethnic communities, which was quite extraordinary. And it becomes much more fragmented. In terms of the ECCs and FECA during this time as well, because of what I've actually indicated, in that many organisations were actually getting and receiving a whole lot of resources, what it meant was that for the representative bodies, we were facing some really big challenges. Because the reality for us is that the groups that came together invariably were the people who had been originally here in the 45 period and the 45, 50s and 60s. But the migration program in Australia was changing very rapidly. We moved from European migration to Asian migration, to South American migration, to Middle Eastern and African migration very, very quickly. And with each new wave, the capacity of our own organisations, whether they be ECCs or the Federation, to actually accommodate this change was questionable. And in fact, many of our structures still are an anachronism in terms of how much they represent the new communities. And it's a challenge I put to you as well here, that as individual communities get larger, how do those representative structures need to work to make sure that they can be a consistent voice? The development of large and resourced ethnic communities and boards, they didn't see value in collective action because they knew that if they asked a minister to come to their function, the minister would be there at the drop of a hat. Why wouldn't they be, especially pre-election? Hundreds of people, give an audience, you don't even have to pay for your ticket. And it was really interesting in terms of where we were actually going with this. And there was a growing cynicism in both the government and even the community sector generally to say, well, these representative bodies, they are okay, but, you know, do we really need them? Does the Italian community, which is now running a service which is multiple funded and runs schools, do we really need an ethnic communities council? And that has been a tension between communities which has actually been quite detrimental to the advocacy framework. The development of also multicultural programs in government, because don't forget, a lot of our advocacy was about government taking more responsibility, having the competence, being able to deal with diverse communities, being able to speak the languages of the communities. But when they started staffing these structures, where did they get the workers from? They took them from the community sector, which is fantastic. But invariably, those community sector skills had gone to government. Now, the issue about that is, and I'll put it to you, anyone who actually works in government, you might have some amazing ideas of what needs to happen, but unless someone puts pressure from outside, the people in your structure will not allow you to do it. So you could have all the best ideas in the world in terms of how to modify and develop your service, but unless there's that pressure, that political pressure from the outside, it just won't happen. And I can tell you right now, since FECA has been far, far louder, almost like a gnat, just constantly at government, the number of people in government who write to me personally saying, I'm so pleased because I find I have no voice. They are in government and they're saying it, and I think that's really interesting. So the challenge is really for the sector to get its voice. Now, what's fundamental to our advocacy is the existence of evidence, especially when advocacy is directed towards resource allocation. What is it about what we're trying to do? Now, I've talked about the funding of ethnic communities potentially being a negative, but it's also a positive. If by funding a service I can actually deliver an aged care service or an employment service in a far more culturally specific way, then that's not a bad thing. But the reality is that the funding of ethnic communities was still only a small fraction of what they were in the overall population. That we weren't getting commensurate levels of funding going into ethnic communities that they represented in the population. And the one I tend to use a great deal, and I'll test against this, is the whole area of ageing. Because we have this phenomena in Australia now, because the bulk of the migration came in 1945 to 1965, the reality is that that group is now pensionable and past pensionable, ageing, and with ageing is moving into a needs set. They're actually getting frail aged in terms of requiring need. Now, because ageing issues are very much personal and family, we know them. What happens in most families? Someone gets older, there is a reliance on their children to take care of them. And that becomes really important. And with that, then, the sense of, well, that's something we should be doing because we're family. It's not something necessarily that we need to get from government. The reality was that the more we moved into the development of community-based service for older people, the more ethnic communities were missing out. Now, the reasons for that are twofold. One is they weren't asking for the services. But secondly, the people who were being funded to provide the services, they weren't asking them to come to the service. There was a total break. And I think that's fundamental, because then if you start looking and arguing around what I'm talking about here, demographics, preference, usage, impediments and evaluation, you actually start coming up with some quite specific things. If the government provides $1 million for a service and people of non-English speaking background make up a third of that population, yet their activity and their access to that service is only at 5% of the service, I would put it to you that that is fundamentally inequitous, because those resources are for the whole community, not just for the white community or the English-speaking community. And one of the practical differences we have in Australia than you would have here is the fact that we have very large groups of people who do not speak English. Huge groups. And the lack of realisation that being in Australia 30, 40 years, language does not allow you or give you. We have data around the ageing in the Vietnamese community, which indicates that 60 to 70% of everyone in that age cohort, 60 plus, cannot speak English. Across that community, 1 in 3 cannot speak English. In our Chinese community, 1 in 4 cannot speak English. Now, that is a fundamental reality, because what it means is then if you're going to provide a service and you cannot provide it in that language, it is inaccessible to those people. It's a fundamental relationship. So what we need to do is understand the demographics. We need to know that right now in Australia, the percentage of people 65 plus overall is 17%. And that's already been seen as critical. But in those who are Italian-born, it's 52%. Those who are Ukrainian-born, it's 54%. So those numbers then become really effective, because then when I go to speak to government, I say, we have really got to look at the ageing of the population and what you're actually doing. They can't just say, well, we've translated this information. I'll say, well, it's not good enough. It's not good enough, because right now, in order for you to deal with the ageing care needs of these communities, you need to be able to articulate the fact that in some communities, not all, some, the need for aged care services is so high that you will actually have to fund ethnic-specific or multicultural, or indeed direct your other funded services to direct their services to those communities.